Very good evening to everyone. It has just gone 6 o'clock. We're a minute behind. Thank you for joining me. This is Christopher Duigan coming to you from my home in KwaZulu-Natal on Wednesday, the 3rd of February. And thank you for joining us. We hope you can stay with us for the next hour or so for our session of Piano Hour, where I'm going to be telling you a session, presenting a session and telling you a series of tales of intrigue, as I've called it. I've called it this evening, a selection of really fascinating stories, some actually very, I think, quite funny, some very bizarre stories. Not academic. I think some of them might not be really based in academic truth. I'm not sure how much truth there really. I have done my research just to check. So far I haven't seen anything that said this is rubbish, but nevertheless, this is just meant to be a fun and enjoyable program. I'm going to be talking quite a lot, but also playing music that is going to give you some of the background to some of the pieces and just illustrate various points. And we'll be starting in a minute. So make yourselves comfortable. Once again, this is a live stream. This is absolutely live, and it's coming to you there's no charge. It's a free presentation across various platforms of Facebook, YouTube, etc. You'll find all of my links at my website, musicrevival.co.za. Please join the mailing list there, subscribe to my YouTube channel, like the Facebook pages, this particular Christopher Duigan Pianist. That seems to be the most central of the Facebook pages. You can be friends with me too on Facebook if you'd like to be. And if you're able to support us financially, that's always much appreciated. The support that has been coming in has been amazing. I've been writing more thank you emails this week to a number of people, generous donors, as well as to people who've been supporting us with a ticket or just a basic income or basic amount every month for the last 10 or 11 months, which we're very, very grateful for. I'm very, very grateful for, and I really appreciate everyone's support who's kept this project going and who's made this possible. But speaking of support, and this is an interesting and I think a very important announcement for everybody, in the last couple of months, I did mention this the other night, but the last couple of months we've had some rather harrowing experiences with power outages in this part of the city, as well as the ongoing load shedding that happens in this part of the country. And for those of you who are not in South Africa, load shedding, this rather precarious situation where there seems to be a shortage of power nationally. And so everyone gets sort of a 2-hour period where we don't have power. And often the power just disappears. You never know whether it's actual load shedding, which generally is scheduled, or whether in fact it's just a local situation where our entire regional or city or part of our city has just gone down. And just to recap, that we had a session of 7 days over New Year without power. So very pleased to announce that, talking of support, Barry, who is running the controls, who is supporting me, obviously has done so for the past 28 years, has dipped into his nest egg and invested in a really amazing solar system with batteries. So in fact, load shedding and all of the stress and all of the uncertainty about whether we're going to have power to even present the live stream. It's one thing not having power to watch the live stream, but it's another thing not having power to actually present it. We realize that sticking to these times of Wednesday and Saturday at 6 p.m. is really crucial. Barry has taken that leap, and we have an amazing solar system now, which is bringing in free energy from the sun, storing it in batteries that will keep us, the entire house, going for up to 9 or 10 hours at a time. So all of those concerns are now a thing of the past, not only for myself, not only for everyone here, but all of you at home, that these streams we will always have power to go out. So thank you to Barry. We're incredibly grateful on behalf of everyone. I am incredibly grateful that you've taken that support and taken that major step forward to ensure that our live streams go on without a hitch. So, moving on to our session of Tales of Intrigue. A few weeks ago, I mentioned the idea that Bach, J.S. Bach, the great Johann Sebastian Bach, when we were looking at composer portraits, had 22 children, which I had to correct the next time. He had 20 children, not 22. And just a few dates, I've got a few notes just to help me through. Between the ages of when he was 23 to 57 years old, he fathered 20 children. And of those, only 10 survived into adulthood. Many of the children actually died at birth within the first day or first week or so. One of them 3 months, one of them at 5 years, and one of them at 7 years. And as the well-known saying goes, there was J.S. Bach, and he married, and he had 10 children, and then his wife died. Then he married another wife, and then he died. And that's, I mean, I don't know how anyone can cope with having 20 children, let alone 10 children around the house. But Bach married Maria Barbara and had 2 children with her, and then subsequent 10 children with Anna Magdalena when he remarried. And 4 of them, this is an interesting point, 4 of them went on to become musicians. 4 of his sons. Barry's going to bring up an image which shows you the very well-known portrait of J.S. Bach that I talked about a few days ago, with little inserts also. I need to move that way. Inserts also of his 4 sons. And there you can see Carl Philipp Emanuel, Wilhelm Friedman, Johann Gottfried, and Johann Christian Bach. Now, the 2 most famous musicians out of that, the 2 most celebrated musicians still to this day, out of J.S. Bach, Johann Sebastian's sons, are Carl Philipp Emanuel, principally because he went on to write a very important document on the art of keyboard playing, which really detailed in a great sense what the correct style of playing the keyboard of the time. And it really gives us a very useful and accurate historical account of what was considered to be the appropriate or good taste in terms of fingering, in terms of ornamentation of the notes. Ornamentation would be when you, there's little trills, the little mordants, the little ornamentations around the notes. The composer will write out notes, and it was expected that the performers would include their own ornamentation around it. What the good style or a good way of improvising would be, what a good way of studying music and learning the keyboard, because obviously what happens in one age does not necessarily apply to others. So it really is a very useful insight into the customs and the style of that period that he lived. Very importantly, the other son who was very well known was in fact Johann Christian's son, Christian Bach, who was known as the London Bach. He went to London and became a very good friend and supporter of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And in fact, we all know that Mozart wrote 27 piano concertos. And I don't know if you've ever wondered, well, what happened? You know, we always seem to hear the same ones, the concerto in D minor, the concerto in C minor, occasionally some of the others, but no one ever hears the very first, what happened to Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 1. It's very seldom performed. The first 6 of Mozart's piano concertos are actually arrangements of music by Johann Christian Bach. And so Mozart was very inspired by his style and by his music, and I think as a very good friend. So Mozart, as a young man, arranged his music as his own piano concertos. They are based on Johann Christian Bach's music. The other son, the eldest son, which is Wilhelm Friedrich, I am going to come back to a little bit later because there's got a very interesting story around that. The music that I'm going to play for you, yes, Lucy, no, I'm not ready for you yet, thank you. The music I'm going to play for you is a very interesting copy, selection of pieces from the Anna Magdalena notebook. Now, Anna Magdalena, Bach's second wife, like I'm sure a very musical family of the day, she also was a keyboard player, she sang beautifully, and she had her own notebook or her own music book where she would play from. And various members or herself would write down pieces of music that they'd composed or copy from her husband, Johann Sebastian. And so this book of very charming music for domestic use for her to play was compiled, you might say, over a period. Compiled over a period of time. Okay, Lucy, come on, off you come. Here's little Lucy. She's here ready for. Okay. Lucy, do you want your own notebook? Do you want a little Lucy notebook for piano playing? Would that be a good idea? Do you want to play the piano? Do you want to learn how? Should we give you lessons in appropriate piano playing? Or do you want to go to finishing school for doggies? No answer. That's a little loose. Now, you've had your dinner. Come. Now, everyone's here. Oh no, Wendy Pop's not here. There's Frida's nibbling her foot. Granny Lulu's wandering around in a daze. Not sure where she's going to. Anyway, so back to Anna Magdalena's notebook. The notebook was compiled, as I say, by herself and her sons and music from her husband over a period of time. And it was a private collection for her to play at home. And you can imagine a very convivial situation. I'm not sure how they managed under very modest means with 10 children in the house. But she would be able to sing, play for her own enjoyment, and create her own music in her own way, in a very happy musical family. And so from these pieces, there are a number of short pieces which are often used for young students, and they generally always were written down and assumed that these are compositions mostly, or almost all entirely, of Johann Sebastian Bach. And in fact, the three pieces I'm going to play are three very well-known pieces: a minuet in G, an aria, which she would have sung, but also which could be played, Bist du bei mir, one of Bach's most celebrated songs, and then a beautiful and very sprightly solo, allegro for cembalo, for harpsichord, which has been acknowledged to be written by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. Well, in fact, as it turns out, modern researchers show that none of these pieces are actually by J.S. Bach. You will see the titles come up as Barry brings them through. Even the popular song, the very famous song, Bist du bei mir, is actually written by somebody else. So these are three short pieces from Anna Magdalena's notebook: the minuet, Bist du bei mir, and the allegro, which gives you, in a sense, of what Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's music sounded like. Well, that was the Allegro, the solo Portacembalo for the harpsichord by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. Before that, you heard Bist du bei mir by G.H. Stolzel, actually not by Johann Sebastian Bach. And I started off that selection of 3 short pieces with the Menuet, not by Johann Sebastian Bach, but by Christian Petzold, it now turns out. We seem to be having a slight technical issue here. Barry, everything okay?
We've lost power on the camera.
Why have we lost power on the camera, I wonder?
Can I check?
Yeah, just bear with us for a minute. We have lost one of our cameras and we would really like to have it with us. So, you want me to help you? Still not on. It's usually the power cable going in. It's happened before.
This one's got a battery on, just switch the battery.
Didn't you take the battery out?
Still nothing. Don't worry about it.
Let me just check. Which is the... You sure it's going in the right spot? Well, that's terrible. We can't lose the whole camera.
Still got 3, it's fine. Keep talking to your audio.
Well, what can I say? Okay, well, that's a sad story. Sad state of affairs. Okay, well, sorry about that. It looks like one of our cameras has just stopped working for some reason. That's rather unfortunate, but we've got 3 others, so I'm sure we can carry on. So those 3 pieces gave you an idea. Principally what I wanted to demonstrate was the music of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. Now, the musician, the eldest son, Wilhelm Friedman, was the one that is really it's going to lead us on to the next story. He, as the eldest of Bach's sons, along with Anna Magdalena, received the bulk of Johann Sebastian's estate. Now, the estate was detailed after his death, and there were numerous household possessions, instruments, various pieces of furniture. But in the actual will and in the division of the estate, there was no mention whatsoever of the large library of music that Bach had acquired, not only of his entire compositional output, most of which was unpublished, but also of a number of other scores, numerous scores, which he had copied from other people. Now remember that Bach's music, as I say, was not published. Not much of it was published during his lifetime. Bach had written largely for religious purposes. He had not written much that had been published internationally, like Handel, for instance, who his career moved between major cities of Germany to Italy, ended up in England, and many of his pieces had been published for sale, whereas Bach's music and his life had really revolved around some very small centers, small towns in Germany, a very much more provincial life is the word I'm looking for, rather than Handel, who had a rather international composing career. And as I say, Wilhelm Friedrich was the one who acquired a large portion of Bach's manuscripts, the original manuscripts, the only copy, the only version of them that Bach had written down. So fast forward approximately 70 years or so, and we are going to stay in the city of Leipzig, where Bach had died, and move on to a composer, Felix Mendelssohn. Now, Mendelssohn's a very interesting composer. He comes from a very interesting background. He had been born into a Jewish family that were wealthy bankers in the town. His grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn, was a very well-known Jewish writer on culture, on various ideas around the Jewish culture and the Hebrew. And at a young age, when Mendelssohn was about 15 years old, the whole family decided, well, they converted from Judaism to Christianity. And that is why they assumed the name Bartholdy. You often see Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, a hyphenated version of his name. And the reason why this was done, why they did this apparently, is that the Jewish people as in the town were still largely confined to the confined ghetto spaces. And even within the actual culture, they were forbidden to speak anything other than Hebrew. They were only encouraged to read religious sacred texts. And the grandfather had escaped at some point from this confinement and seen what the rest of the world had actually had to offer. And Mendelssohn and his family realized that, in fact, if they stayed in this position, they would not be able to travel. He would never be able to leave the country. His world would have been very insular and very small. So Mendelssohn went on to become quite a prolific composer, composing numerous pieces as a young child. He was a brilliant virtuoso. He was a genius child composer. He composed some of his very important works when he was still a teenager. And money and affluence was certainly no problem. In fact, even in their home, for some of his earlier compositions, they were performed in his own home, so quite a sizable venue itself, by a private orchestra that was hired in for the occasion. That's quite something, to be a young composer in your teens and have a private orchestra performing your symphonies in your own home. I mean, that's quite something to have. Mendelssohn's sister was also a gifted composer, and interestingly enough, just to see, sometimes Mendelssohn, even in his later years, had to admit that some of the works that he had written under his own names were in fact the compositions of his sister. When he was in Buckingham Palace and was performing and presented a song to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, they remarked on what a delightful composition this was. And in fact, he had to admit that it wasn't his own song, it was his sister who had composed this. Now, when Mendelssohn was 15 years old, his grandmother gave him a Christmas gift. And this was a copy, a personal handwritten copy of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, one of the great Bach works. We have a St. Matthew Passion, a St. John's Passion, and we know that Bach wrote a St. Mark's Passion, which has just disappeared along with who knows what else. This was a private copy. As it turns out, the grandmother's sister was a student of the sons of Johann Sebastian Bach and had acquired access to these copies and also collected a number of Bach's own manuscripts for her own private use. And she managed to have access to the St. Matthew's Passion for long enough for a private personal copy to be handwritten as a birthday gift for the young Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn, of course, was entirely thrilled with this, and several years later, at the age of 19, decided to present a public performance, although albeit scaled down, for orchestra, choir, and soloist. A number of items were left out, using a piano instead of a harpsichord, and certainly in his contemporary romantic style. But he presented what was now going to be the beginning of the Bach revival, a re-interest in Bach's music, which had largely fallen out of favor. Bach's music was very dense, it was very complex, it was very full of very strong ideas, which were not really the flavor of the month, you might say, during the classical period, and certainly not in the early romantic style. So only a few people, those who really studied music seriously, and the intellectuals, still had knowledge of Bach's music. Barry's looking at me meaningly. So Mendelssohn then has this Bach revival, which becomes a great success, and really, you can't say that single-handedly, but certainly he had a great element in reviving an interest in the music of Bach, who had largely fallen into obscurity. One day, now this is the real funny story. One day, apparently, Mendelssohn decides to go off and order his fish and chips at the local market. And he's having his takeaway, you might say, eating his fish and chips. And when he's finishing, he's noticing that the paper, in fact, that the fish and chips is wrapped in, this is according to the story, has something written on it. And on closer inspection, he looks and realizes that, in fact, some of this writing on the paper is, in fact, music notes. He goes home and realizes and discovers that, in fact, what he is reading and what he is writing on this paper, which his fish and chips were served in, is, in fact, the music of J.S. Bach. And not just a copy of J.S. Bach, this was the original manuscript, the only existing copy, probably, of some of Bach's music. Well, he probably ran back to the fish and chip shop and bought the entire collection. And as it happened, as I said, you had Wilhelm Friedman Bach, who was rather careless with Bach's scores. His father's scores had lost track of many of these pieces. This was the original, only version of these pieces, and apparently ended up selling some of it purely as scrap paper. The music seemed to have no value, and the value of the paper, probably high quality paper which was written on, was of more value than he thought the music himself. And so many of these scores apparently that were written for various occasions. Remember, Bach wrote a cantata, a work for orchestra, choir and soloists every week for a period, I think, of 12 or 15 years, a new piece of music every week, lasting, 20, 30 minutes or more. And so this St. Mark's Passion, which we know existed, Bach wrote about it, has still never appeared. It appears to be completely lost. This is a work that would probably last 2 to 3 hours. So Mendelssohn has this unique place in terms of music, the lightness which he brought to his music. As I say, he was a very gifted composer and a pianist, and also spent much of his life and interest doing watercolors, a very gifted artist as well. So I would like to play for you a piece of music by Mendelssohn, which I have performed before. It seems to have sometimes go better than others, but this is something I keep coming back to. It's the Rondo Capriccioso, and it really shows this beautiful lyricism, this ease, the grace, a brilliance, a facile quality to the music, that after a slow introduction, the music goes into a really jaunty theme of great lightness, sprightly dance elements that goes round, a rondo, a round figure. The theme comes back repeatedly in a capricious nature. Rondo Capriccioso by Felix Mendelssohn. Barry, do you want to try the camera again? Would you like to?
I'll try it. It'll be black.
Little what?
This is back.
Wonder what's gone wrong.
Don't worry about it.
Very good. Well, that was the Rondo Capriccioso by Felix Mendelssohn, and that was a piece of music that I used to show something of the facility, the light, beautiful, glistening effect of Mendelssohn's music, the happy, sunny atmospheres throughout much of his music. I was experiencing a happy, sunny atmosphere there myself when I saw that our fourth camera suddenly appeared. You saw me looking away. Let me just check. Barry, can you put us onto camera number 4? Let's see if it's working. There we go. Yes. Oh, yes, Frida's come to visit. Good. It's seeing as camera number 4 is working. Hello, Frida. How are you doing? Did you like the Mendelssohn? Frida doesn't like it when I play lots of notes in the treble. Does the treble hurt your ears? Put your hand up. Yes, it's a hand up. Yes, it's hurting my ears. I don't like the treble. Oh, you're the prettiest girl. Frida's the silver dapple. Someone said, oh, she's so old, she's grey. No, that's her special coat of silver dapple. It's silver, it's not grey. It's silver. It's silver. I'm very special. Right, so this evening's very informal session. As I said, we really moving things around. Camera failures, it's just stories around piano, and I see that I'm really running out of time. I don't think we're even going to get through half of the program. So I am going to move on from a composer that was full of ease, that had such a happy upbringing. Money was no object. Everything just seemed to go. I mean, having a private orchestra and having a brilliant sister as well, being world recognized as a young composer, as a great genius. How absolutely charming and delightful. What an absolute contrast to our next story, which comes from Ludwig van Beethoven. Now, Beethoven, as I've always said, had the absolute opposite experience. He suffered terrible abuse as a child. His father tried to pass him off as a child genius, making him play in all sorts of dubious venues, bars and restaurants, and telling people that he was 7 when he was actually 11 or 12 years old, and obviously so. And father was completely drunk often, and Beethoven had to endure a really dreadful time, and eventually had to actually fend for the rest of his family, and as a 14-year-old had to start earning a living and try and scrounge for money to support the family, because the father was simply drinking the entire monthly income away. Now, Beethoven has a unique sense of struggle in his life. Apart from the difficult upbringing, he has this incredible terrible fate, as he said, dealt the most terrible blow as a gifted composer by taking his hearing away, losing his hearing as a young man, gradually over a period of years until he could hear nothing. And in fact, his performing career got worse and worse as he was trying to play. Either he wasn't able to hear the notes, so he would either bang some passages out furiously or actually not play at all because he was trying to play so quietly and in fact make no sound whatsoever. Now, all of this, of course, leads to a great sense of struggle and a great sense of temperament in terms of fire in Beethoven's life. And the story that I'd like to tell you about, which is very interesting, happens with the Prince Lichnowsky. Now, Count Waldstein, who was one of Beethoven's patrons and the recipient of the Waldstein Sonata and a great friend, took Beethoven to the prince to introduce him because he was a great patron of the arts and a great supporter and lover of music. And the prince was very impressed with Beethoven, took Beethoven in and allowed him to live in a small room in his apartments. And eventually Beethoven became more and more of the life. He had better access to bigger and bigger rooms that the prince provided for him. But Beethoven soon grew tired of all this very fancy and very royal court atmosphere where he had to constantly be dressed impeccably every day for his duties and to appear for the court's friends, the prince's friends, and also to behave amongst all these people who he really didn't feel much in common with. And on one occasion, the prince asked the prince, however, was very taken with a young female, no, Lucy, who was of great interest to him and proceeded to flirt and talk to her throughout the performance. Now, Beethoven didn't like this at all. No, Lucy, no, you can't. This is not your moment. Beethoven didn't like this at all and eventually got up, stormed off, left the palace, never went back to the apartment, took a bust, a plaster bust, which the prince had given him of himself, smashed it to the floor into 1,000 pieces, and left a note behind that said, addressed to the prince, "You are who you are by accident of birth. There are many princes and many noblemen, but there is only one Beethoven." And this gives a very clear sense, I think, already of, even at a young age, how Beethoven, the sense of struggle and the sense of determination that Beethoven had, but also the sense of self-belief that really took him through his music and through his life. Another very important quote, which I think really supports that, he said, "What I have in my heart and soul must find a way out. That is a reason for music." And this element of struggle, the sense of determination in Beethoven's music, I think is such an incredibly important part. So apart from telling the prince exactly who he thought the prince was and who he thought Beethoven was, the other fascinating thing I found about Beethoven's life is this complete absorption in his own world, in his own days of music making in the way that he lived. This rift between the prince and the composer was never actually healed. The prince tried to apologize, and Beethoven never really forgave him. And at one point later in his life, Beethoven was living in one of 29 apartments. He moved 29 times in Vienna, never a popular tenant with any landlord or landlady. And at one point, he was living in an apartment which is now the Pascalati house. Now, I've been to this place, and Barry's going to show you a picture, because these are the stairs that lead to the 4th floor of the apartment in this house. And the prince, despite, as I say, trying to rectify and trying to make amends with Beethoven in this relationship, and Beethoven would hear none of it, in his later years fell on quite hard times and would walk up 4 flights of stairs and sit on these exact stairs, listening to Beethoven playing and listening to Beethoven practice. In the museum is this famous portrait by Joseph Marlowe, Very famous portrait there. And downstairs around the corner is a restaurant established in 1618 called zum Schwarze Kamel. And this is one of the restaurants, in fact, that Beethoven used to order food from quite regularly. And I'm going to ask Barry to put up a picture. This is a picture that I took, and that is Barry in the restaurant. We were in Vienna a few years ago, and we decided, or Barry actually was determined, that he wanted to go and eat at Beethoven's restaurant. So there is Barry enjoying lunch at some Schwarze Kamel, one of Beethoven's restaurants. Beethoven himself would spend many hours, most days, in his rooms. If he was not walking in the forest, he would hide himself away and be completely obsessed with his music. And when people did actually gain entry into his room, they were absolutely horrified by what they found. There were clothes strewn all over the floor, lying on top of furniture. There were manuscripts and pages of sketches of pieces of music that Beethoven was working on or that was looking at, strewn on the floor over everything. The piano was in a shocking state. Often the piano leg had been broken off and was hanging precariously. And the most shocking part, I think, for most people they wrote about, they would often notice a chamber pot sitting under the piano that had not been emptied for several days. Half-eaten plates of food lying about. Beethoven had a real temper, and apparently if the food didn't arrive when he wanted it, or if he didn't order what he wanted, he would have no qualms about throwing the food directly back at the person that had brought it. And so this real chaotic life of a single bachelor is a picture that we get from Beethoven in his later years, and that gives us a sense of this complete absorption. One of the things I read about today was that, and I'm sure this wasn't popular with the landladies either, landlords, that he had a habit of writing with red crayon all over the walls. If he suddenly had a musical idea, wanted to sketch something out, he thought nothing about scribbling on the wall. I know someone else who actually does that, but I won't go into that. But it's a real sign of the moment comes, you want to remember something, let's just write it down on the wall. A friend of mine had her mother, actually, it's a very interesting story, it's similar, had a situation where she used to write messages for her husband on the artwork next to the telephone. It was quite a valuable artwork, but she was always short of a piece of paper. She thought nothing about scribbling on the artwork, the messages and phone numbers that she thought she needed to add. So to give a sense of Beethoven's music, I'm going to carry on with the piece from the sonata in D minor, the Tempest Sonata, supposedly written after Beethoven had read or seen a performance of Shakespeare's The Tempest, in German known as the Storm Sonata, for the very turbulent, stormy character. But the last movement is particularly interesting. It's a piece of music that starts off at a relentless pace and does not give up. And this dogged determination and this feeling of just carrying on in a relentless way is something which I think is so crucial and gives us such insight into Beethoven's music at its essence. So this is the last movement from the sonata, Opus 31, number 2. the last movement there of the Sonata Opus 31, number 2 in D minor, The Tempest by Ludwig van Beethoven. No, Luce. What now? Why does Lucy want to come up again? You just want to be on the show again. Lucy, Lucy, Lucy. Here is little Lucy. What is it this time? Do you want more scratches? Do you think people should be sending you more hugs and kisses? A number of people have been sending hugs and kisses for Lucy. Yeah, you know that. Would you like more hugs and kisses? Would you like a little bony, perhaps? Oh boy, yeah, all come. No, girls, okay, now in your basket. What is it with you tonight? Maybe I'm talking too much and not playing. Maybe they're so used to be playing, and that's what they say in the basket, but tonight they're all, even Granny Loopy, you can hear her wandering around and around. Right, so from Beethoven, Beethoven in his last days and his last years was invited by his friend Anton Schindler to attend a concert of a brilliant young virtuoso, a new pianist, a new kid on the block who was only 12 years old and who was already creating something of a storm. Beethoven went to this concert. He was very deaf, but obviously could hear something of what the musician was playing, sat in the front row and attended a concert by the 12-year-old Franz Liszt. Apparently, at the end of the concert, Beethoven stood up, grabbed the young boy by the shoulders, and gave him a kiss on each cheek. Now, this is a story that Liszt held on to for the rest of his life and known as the consecration kiss, receiving the approval of the great Ludwig van Beethoven for his music, his performance, and his own compositions. However, current research, and so people who are investigating this, realize that in fact the only person that really can account for this, or who really actually bore witness to this event, was Liszt himself. And that in fact the story that Liszt told seemed to change, the details of it changed quite regularly from occasion to occasion, which makes one wonder actually whether in fact this was not a story of Liszt's invention himself. Liszt went on obviously to have a stellar career, possibly the greatest pianist of all time, an incredibly complicated life. I just read a fascinating biography about him. He was involved, had 2 major affairs in his life, and the second, the Princess Caroline Sayn-Wittgenstein, was someone that he really hoped to marry. And fascinating story in this whole affair was that, in fact, after many years of wrangling, hoping for marriage, the princess was married at the time. She was a Polish woman who had inherited enormous estates and had incredible wealth, and also was a very devout Catholic. So there was no way that she was able to marry the young Franz Liszt, or the age that he was then, without the marriage being annulled. And after many political dealings back and forward with the Vatican and with the Pope, they were eventually granted annulment of the marriage on the account or the grounds that her marriage to the prince that she was married to was in fact had taken place under duress, that she was forced into this. The wedding was arranged, and I didn't know this actually until a few days ago when I read this biography. The wedding was arranged, the church was filled with flowers, all of the guests arrived for the wedding. The entire occasion was about to take place, and a letter at the last minute arrived from the Pope so that they had changed their mind, and this marriage was not being annulled. So in fact, she was not able to marry Franz Liszt after all. It seems that her husband, and there was interjections from the Tsar Nicholas, I think it was, who had realized that in fact there was going to be a lot to lose in terms of the estates and in terms of the wealth leaving the country and the people who were due to inherit if in fact the marriage was annulled. So that came to a rather unfortunate end for Franz Liszt. The other story about Liszt, which I found rather bizarre, and which is not about himself, but about one of his many followings. People always were seduced by this great pianist, the long flowing hair, the blue eyes, which seemed to captivate. And Liszt was never one who turned away any attention. It seems that whenever someone of the fairer sex gave him attention and was willing to show him interest, he was always quite available, apparently. And wherever Liszt went, people were often looking for souvenirs, a discarded handkerchief, a lock of his hair. The great superstar, they wanted to keep something with them. And apparently one day Liszt was walking through the street and was smoking a cigar and discarded the cigar in the gutter. And a young woman saw this, realized who Liszt was, ran up, grabbed the cigar and kept it in a locket in her breast, her bosom, for the rest of her life. And it explained, apparently people later said, why there was a rather stale smell of tobacco which followed her wherever she went. Such was the entrancement with Liszt and his fame at the time. I would, however, like to play for you a piece by Liszt that has something of this dazzling effect and give you an idea of the dazzling nature of Liszt's playing and music. And this is a piece which is always a bit daring, but which I'm going to try. I'm also going to be playing on Saturday, called La Campanella. It's one of his famous pieces, inspired by the writing of the violinist Nicola Paganini. He writes this entire composition in the top half of the piano, exploiting the sound of bells. La Campanella, the bells. And it's a beautiful melody from the violin concerto, second violin concerto of the violinist Paganini, who had inspired Liszt because he had been so famous and so incredibly successful as a performing musician in his own life, cultivating this air of otherworldliness and a brilliance that was so exceptional that people thought that he had sold his soul for the devil in exchange for his violinistic talent. And Liszt realized how successful this was and how many people flocked to his concerts and bought tickets, and what a great career he made. A kind of the first days of showbiz, you might say. So this is Liszt's La Campanella. You're going to have to be quiet for this one, girls. I need all the focus and help I can get here. Chaos tonight. Like Campanella, Franz Liszt, sorry, loose, accompanied by dogs. It'll go better on Saturday. I've got another opportunity to try it. Brilliant, very exciting piece of music, but very ear-tickling, lots of interesting, fascinating textures that Liszt conjures up. What is it with you tonight? Come, in your basket. Calm, please. Right, well, so moving from Liszt, I'm going to move on to Chopin. Chopin was very good friends with Liszt. They both lived in Paris. I'm not saying they were greatest of pals. They had a healthy respect for each other. But I have a feeling that Liszt was more generous, was in a position acknowledged as the grand virtuoso of the day, to be more generous towards Chopin than he actually returned. Chopin himself was a very somewhat withdrawn, neurotic, you might say, somewhat nervous individual whose music was very delicate and whose playing was known for its great subtlety, whereas Liszt was the grand virtuoso of the day and who conquered concert halls all over the world as far as he traveled, brilliantly performing to large numbers of audiences, large crowds of people who were completely overwhelmed with his playing, his grand gestures, kind of theatrical nature and theatrical style. Chopin himself said that he was envious of the way that Liszt played his own etudes, the etudes which are such fascinating pieces in Chopin's music, designed to really exploit the piano in such a delicate and gentle way. Liszt would have approached these pieces with great brilliance and really exploiting and exhausting the elements of speed, of volume and excitement. Chopin taught his students, many students, who travel from afar, include, as I've mentioned before, Emma Wedgwood, the granddaughter of Joseph Wedgwood of the Wedgwood Empire, ceramics empire, and who went on to marry Charles Darwin. She traveled from England to Paris to study with Chopin, who was, to say, very sought after as a teacher, only teaching the best and the best possible places, charging the highest fees, traveling around Paris in the most expensive carriages, dressed in the finest outfits with the most beautiful, extraordinary, expensive fabrics on his waistcoats and the whitest gloves possible, even though he could sometimes barely afford to actually pay for all of this. But keeping up that appearance and keeping up that facade was incredibly important to him. In his teaching, and a lot of it comes, we've learned so much from a fascinating book by the author Jean-Jacques Eigeldinger, Chopin's pianist and teacher. We really learn how, from a great collection of anecdotes and details that Chopin had written down at scores, and all of these are brought into one place, and learn how Chopin advised and recommended that each finger of the hand had a different role to play, a different nature, a different color, and a different sound, whereas Liszt taught that the piano was to be played with a certain aggression, that each note, each finger should be developed to produce an equal volume of attack and sound that would certainly suit his style. And I'm going to ask Barry to bring up a fascinating little cartoon here, which gives us a sense of Chopin, who will see scowling with his characteristic very sharp nose, scowling, pointing very determinedly at the pianist, the young student. And he says, that is the Liszt way of playing. Do not play like that. Not I don't like it. Just do not do it. Do not play like Liszt. The poor student has a very horrified look, looking back in aghast and shock that she should be told not to play like Liszt. But certainly it was Chopin's taste not to do so. Chopin, Polish by birth, spent much of his output, or composed many pieces in Polish style, traditional dances, Krakowiak, Polonaise, Mazurka, even the waltzes. And the Mazurka is a very interesting dance, which I'm going to play for you, because it brings us to a story, an interesting anecdote about Chopin discussing this with the composer Meyerbeer, Jacob Meyerbeer, after a performance. Chopin had played in one of these drawing rooms, this Mazurka, and they started discussing the tempo or the meter, the number of beats in the bar. And the Mazurka, like the waltz, is written with 3 beats in a bar, except whereas the waltz has an emphasis on the first beat, the Mazurka has a rather unusual emphasis on the 3rd beat, and sometimes a somewhat distorted or held pace or a held measure in between. So, most famous Mazurka. Playing that quite straight, but it seems that some people have said that in fact you have to be Polish, with growing up with this traditional sound of the traditional Polish Mazurka in your ear to really be able to perform these pieces. Other people have said that the Mazurka, its rhythms and its style are merely an influence on what Chopin writes, which is more classically orientated. Anyway, at this particular occasion, Chopin had played this Mazurka, which I'm going to play for you now. And the composer said to him, the Mazurka is a fascinating piece. It's written with 4 beats in a bar. And Chopin was absolutely horrified. He said, no, of course, the Mazurka is written with 3 beats in a bar. And this argument ensued until Chopin played the piece again. And while he was counting out his 3 beats in the bar and stamping away, the composer Meyerbeer was counting out in exact same time measure 4 beats in the bar. Chopin was muttering under his breath, left and never came back. But it does give us a sense of something about the Chopin style, and I'm going to try and play my own version. I'm not going to try and imitate this extreme version that Chopin might have played in his own way, but this is a very beautiful Mazurka, Opus 33, number 2. That was the Berserker, Opus 33, number 2, giving you an idea of the music and the freedom of the rhythmic style that got Chopin into an argument about what the Berserker really is. And of course, one would really assume that Chopin, being the Polish pianist himself, would know. That brings us to an end in this evening's session. We have run over time, and I've got several other details which I'd like to add, but we'll keep those for another day. We'll have to have part 2. How's Lucy? Yes, okay. And thank you very much for joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed a selection of rather intriguing stories and unusual anecdotes. As I said, these are not academic. These are accounts which sometimes are not certain, which are not always correctly accounted for, but certainly make great, interesting stories about how these composers lived and some other incidences that might have happened in their life. If you're able to support us, please see your BSc2 QR codes on the screen. Apparently, the QR code for Cricket will accept international donations or international purchases. The other one via Yoko apparently is only for South African purchases. I found this out today. Well, that's what I heard from somebody. I don't know if anyone else can attest to what the outcome of that is. Thanks to Barry at the controls for running images and texts and fixing the camera halfway through the performance. Thanks to the girls for not behaving tonight, for being completely reckless and still wandering around. A great distraction this evening in the studio. But anyway, it's part of the show. It's part of the home setup that we have here. We look forward to seeing you. I've got a very exciting, very brilliant program on Saturday evening coming up with music by Ravel and Chopin and Liszt and Schumann. And I hope you can join us then on Saturday at 6 p.m. Please look after yourself, stay well, keep well, and we look forward to catching up with you in the weekend and next week, Wednesday.